Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Racial and Social Justice Beyond the Dome. Thank you for joining. I'm your host, Dan Yu, and I'm here with, actually, she's a little absent, Carrie Boehner, who's the president of Notre Dame Club of Pittsburgh. She's having a little power issue. Before we get started, I will quickly run through a couple housekeeping items so everyone is up to speed on how to use the Zoom webinar features. Everyone has been muted upon entry to allow for clean and clear audio. We welcome your questions and comments. Click the Q&A button at the bottom of the Zoom window to launch the Q&A window. From here, type your question or comment into the Q&A box and click send. I will be monitoring the Q&A throughout the webcast, and we'll try to get to as many questions as possible. And we will have time for Q&A towards the end of the show. If you have any technical questions, you can use the same Q&A window to communicate with me, and I will do my best to assist you. As a reminder, this show is being recorded. So today we welcome Avis Boyd, Notre Dame class of 1982. She is managing director of the Alumni Diversity Council. She's married to a Domer and mom to two Notre Dame grads. Avis is Notre Dame through and through, having volunteered on a club level, regional level, and now on an international level. Thank you for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having me.
So everyone, this is a safe space. Avis is offering to all of you this opportunity to be transparent in asking questions about race that maybe you've been reticent to ask a person of color, but that would help you to better understand the racial plight that our nation is currently in and help you be more sensitive or informed of the cause for racial justice and the importance of anti-racism efforts. Sort of like an Ask Me Anything, but about racial issues. So you can make your question anonymous, so type away and know that your questions will be anonymous. And we'll try to work those into the conversation, or we'll be able to get to them in the Q&A towards the end of the show. So, Avis, thank you again. Now, you've had quite a journey before Notre Dame, and you grew up in the Deep South. What was that like for you?
For me, it was great, actually. My kids think I'm crazy, but I'm a native of Jackson, Mississippi, and I came up during the 60s. So a lot of the efforts that contributed to the freedom and that I enjoyed actually happened before that. I didn't realize quite what I was in the thick of, as most children don't, because my parents pretty much sheltered me from those things. It was later on in life that I learned some of the challenges that my mom had at her place of employment. She was prior military and registered nurse, surgical, and she could not get a job actually in her field of study because of her race. And so that was challenging for the family, but as a child, I didn't realize that at the time. So she had to actually first get a job in Los Angeles and then transfer to St. Louis, and then get a transfer back to Jackson eventually. And I think that probably took about 3 years that she was away from me on and off, trying to get back home, which was where she wanted to be because family was very important to be around. So
Gotcha.
Otherwise, I was raised to know that if I put my heart, mind, and effort to things, I could do and be anything that I wanted to be. So that was kind of how I approached life.
That's fairly lucky, right? Especially in the Deep South. I mean, I think all minorities here in the U.S. have experienced at least some indirect racism or microaggressions. So did you later realize, maybe later, that your family had experienced direct racism?
Well, besides the situation that happened with my mom, I would say that at the dinner table, that would be kind of where discussions about work would be had on a regular basis. And in all honesty, she kind of just made it seem like it's just one of the challenges and struggles in life. I can remember my earliest memory of anything race-oriented was probably when I was about 8 years old, when Dr. Martin Luther King died, and I remembered, or was killed, and I remembered watching his funeral on television and being very sad about what happened to him and understanding why it happened to him. So I was aware of the realities. We lived in a middle class, all Black neighborhood. I went to an all Black Catholic school. And so until I got to junior high, that was the first time that I was in school where I was the minority in 6th grade. And in high school, racism kind of reared its head. Our mascot for our high school was the Rebels. And someone had the bright idea of wearing a Confederate uniform at a pep rally as a symbol of being part of the mascot. And that didn't go over too well. That was a little too rebellious. We had the Confederate flag being flown at our games in rebellion of the fact that we had a student council that said we need to change that name. And so that was kind of in high school was when things really started to kind of flare, I would say, a little bit more. But even then it was still somewhat contained. And I must say, I was never called the N-word in all honesty until I left Mississippi. And it was actually in the late 80s. I was in Los Angeles, California. And of course, I took exception with the individual in the public that said that. But other than that, I felt like, you know, where I was raised, I felt like people, there was no pretension about who they were. And I think that that was a good thing. If they didn't like you, you knew that. So you didn't press or you weren't wanted. And unlike the situation when I moved north, things were a little more pretentious and you really didn't quite know what to expect of people. They would show you one thing and they would actually be a different way. So I kind of preferred knowing where I stood in the South, despite the other challenges that the South has.
Right. And so now we growing up then in Jackson and going to a high school where the symbol was there right in front of you. It's interesting that during that time, so this would be the 70s, right, mm-hmm. that the student council actually was aware and wanted to vote that symbol out.
Correct. It was an initiative that I happened to be involved in. We had a committee that was selected by students, and it was quite controversial because it was my junior year. That's when you got your class rings, the rebel sign, and the symbol we had as a mascot before then was kind of the Colonel, like the Kentucky Fried Chicken Colonel. That was our symbol of our mascot before any of this happened. And then what we did was we voted for another name, and that meant that anyone that wanted to have the previous name on their rings and other things, they needed to pay for that separately. So that didn't bode very well either. But eventually, by my senior year, it kind of all blew over for the most part, and there were no hard feelings. People understood, and parents were probably the tougher cookie, to be honest with you. They were the ones that were rebellious to the end, but we made it through. Once again, people were who they were. You knew you could agree to disagree and keep going.
Gotcha. And so now many Blacks in the 60s and the 70s, they attended HBCUs, right? So historically Black colleges and universities. But you set your eyes on Notre Dame. And so how did you, kind of, get to go down that path?
Well, ironically for me, college was about football. And I actually wanted to play football.
All right.
My dad said, "No, Avis, you can't do that." Which I just couldn't understand why that was not possible. I thought I'd be an awesome quarterback. But and the reason that football was so important to me as it related to college was because I did grow up in Jackson, Mississippi, which was home to a very popular HBCU called Jackson State. And it was the place that Walter Payton went to college. And I also got a chance to see Doug Williams play ball when I was in school, when I was growing up, because of the conference that the Jackson State was in, the SWAC conference. In that area. So my grandmother, who was really the football fanatic, actually wrapped me in a blanket as soon as she could get me out of the house to a game. And I had been sitting in a stadium for football games since I was an infant, literally. And so for me, that was what the college experience was first about. Then in school, I learned, of course, about the importance of academics. And then I had this desire to want to go to a school that would be academically sound. And I was a cradle Catholic, from the hospital to the church. And so it was natural for me to start to consider those types of schools. But there was a defining point for me that actually steered me towards Notre Dame. And of course, it was football. It was the fact that I had an opportunity to go to the Sugar Bowl when Bear Bryant was playing Air Parsegian for the national championship. It was
Oh,
my
the
freshman
big
year,
game, the big game.
just a slightly large game.
Yeah.
It was my freshman year in high school, and my dad had gotten tickets, and we went, and I was just so excited to be there. But what amazed me was the spirit of the fans from Notre Dame. I mean, no one knew me from Adam. We weren't down there with any friends or people from home that had gone to Notre Dame. It was just my family and I, and I was so well received because I was a Notre Dame fan, and I was so thrilled to be embraced by the people, as if I went to school there almost. That it really impressed me, and I thought, this is where I want to go to school. We got a national championship now. We beat Bear Bryant. They've got top academics. I had wanted to be a physician initially. And so I thought I need to have, really strong academics and go to a good school so I can get in med school. And that was the mindset that I had. But the challenge was that was the only school I wanted to go to. Yes.
And you were willing to put all your chips into one school.
Oh, I was more than willing. That's what I did until my high school counselor, this nun, stood on her head in her habit practically and said, Avis, you have to apply to another school. And being the idealistic young person I was at the time, my thought was, I do not want to spend money on an application fee to a school I don't want to go to.
Why would you, right?
Why would you want to do that? And she said, Avis, please, you just don't understand, sweetie. It's so hard to get in there. You really need to apply to another school. So because of her insistence, literally, I applied to St. Louis U because they already had a med school attached. And since
that's not easy to get in either.
There was no football. There was no football though. So at least I knew I could get in college until I could transfer, of course, if necessary.
So you got into St. Louis first?
I did. I found out about St. Louis first. I applied to Notre Dame first. And then, like I said, she stood on her head. And so I applied to St. Louis U. I heard back from them and it was like, okay, I can go to college. But I mean, bells and whistles went off when I went out to the mailbox and got my acceptance letter and called my mom at work, and tears and happiness and joy and everything. So it was outstanding.
That's great. What a wonderful story. So we actually have a question from the audience. Why are such symbols like the mascot handled so sensitively? Why are they just not looked at a part of history, right or wrong, or even as a positive reminder of how far we came? It's a great question.
So when I was in high school, the mascot issue came about because, and as we said back then, what had been represented to us as our mascot and what presented without any discussion, just out of the blue, someone had their great-great-grandfather's Confederate uniform out of a trunk, and they wore this into a pep rally assembly. And we had.
So this was a real uniform. It wasn't just like a costume.
No, this was a real uniform. This was
so the gray.
Uniform.
Wow.
That's right. It was a real uniform. And we had, at the time, I would have been in my beginning of my junior year. And we had some senior African-American males who walked out of the pep assembly. And that was a required assembly. Yeah. They were suspended from school. And that was what started the big stink. And the discussion was about representation. And how could you expect African-Americans to want to be represented by that symbol going forward? Right. Now, the Confederate flag that's like a Dixieland favorite. So that was there, it wasn't our flag. It wasn't a symbol of the school. So that was not problematic. But when you were trying to make that a symbol of the school, a representation of the school, and this was a Catholic school, it was just not acceptable. And because of the strife that it caused, it was determined that we needed to select a different mascot. And so it's a mascot for all and not a mascot for some. And so that was the reason why I believe, the students got together and said, okay, we need to do something about this. We need a mascot. And that's what happened.
That's an interesting take, right? That the students were able to make change, even with all the societal pressures, right, from parents and from administrators.
Oh, definitely. And there were students that, I mean, these were my buddies. I mean, you know, it was whites and blacks. We were not diverse to have Asians and Hispanic or Native Americans in our school. And so there was a white-black thing, my friends, and there were times we agreed to disagree, but when it came down to the fact that it needed to happen, then we needed to wrap our heads around a solution together, as opposed to continuing to dig deeper in dirt that was going to go nowhere.
Right. That makes sense. So you get into Notre Dame, right? And now before you got to Notre Dame, you were looking for some financial assistance, right? With maybe
actually,
an art.
I wasn't even looking, because see, I was idealistic. So I hadn't even gotten to the part about how do we pay for this. It was just to get in. And so
Okay.
An Air Force recruiter came to our school, selected the top folks out of my class. We came to the principal's office, and I didn't understand why we were there. I mean, I hadn't expressed any interest in the Air Force. My mom and dad had both been in the Air Force prior to my birth. So I'd heard the, military stories, but that was it. And he basically said, you have a free scholarship, to the 4-year scholarship to the school of your choice. And I just raised my hand and said, excuse me, but, do you have a program at Notre Dame? Because if Notre Dame's not in that little book, then I'm out. I don't need to be here. And I thought to myself later, my mom would have had a heart attack if she had known I was just going to walk out of a room, where I had a free opportunity to go to the school of my choice with stipends on a monthly basis to, pass that up because it wasn't Notre Dame. So the man got out his little book, and he feverishly looked through, and he said, oh, we have a program there. And I said, okay, then keep talking.
How did he not know about Notre Dame? I mean, come on.
That's what I would have said. So I did end up going into the program, and I did go through Air Force ROTC, and I was an officer commissioned upon graduation.
Gotcha. Now, we have a question from the audience, going back to your childhood. Was your childhood parish an African-American parish? If so, how did that racially segregated experience influence your faith formation?
My parish was an African-American parish. We had both white and black priests that had come through. The nuns that serviced our parish were white. And there were, at the time, one thing I found out when I moved north, people didn't realize how prevalent Black Catholics were in the South. And I think a lot of what was said by your previous guest, Sonny, when he mentioned that he was exposed to Catholicism through education. The same thing happened in the South, that's the predominant way that people get exposed to Catholicism. And so that was our parish, and we had a school that was attached. And once again, I didn't want for anything when I was growing up. I had good academic education. I was in good neighborhoods. I took, dance and tap and Girl Scouts and
football, right? Because you wanted to play
football, yes. But growing up, it was fine. Now, my exposure to other races came because of campus ministry. I was very involved in campus ministry from the time that I was in junior high. And so you would have multiple parishes, obviously, that would get together for retreats and activities. And within our diocese, which was based in Jackson as well as the capital. And that was probably my exposure. And the other thing I'm going to say, which people probably won't really believe, I wasn't looking at people based on color. I was looking at people based on people. And I'm not really sure, I would say maybe my upbringing contributed to that, because people weren't being looked at upon based on the color of their skin. It was about their behavior and the individual. Right. So for me, it was just new people to meet. As you might imagine, I'm sort of an extrovert. So I really enjoyed meeting other people, no matter who they were or where they came from. So it didn't cloud my vision with regard to others. And then I went on to be on a retreat team, a search retreat team. I was the captain of that team, and we had statewide retreats. So we went to various places around the state. So I would say my Catholicism actually, and my faith background, was enriched because of how I started and how I continued, and the fact that there wasn't partiality that was being inbred as I was growing up.
Gotcha. So you go to Notre Dame and you meet the man who would become your husband, Ralph, right?
I did.
And so when you were at Notre Dame, did you experience any difficulties with race while at Notre Dame?
You know, I had such, like, again, I was such an idealist growing up, and I had such an idealistic view of Notre Dame. And very much what attracts our diverse students and all students to Notre Dame now, the brand of the force for good, the brand of our Catholicism and living out our faith through social justice and the social justice teachings of the church, the prevalence of your faith being practiced with, you know, chapels in your dorm and all of that. I just had this very idealistic view of the university, and we were doing okay until I would say my sophomore year. And my husband played bookstore basketball. My not husband at the time, but had a bookstore basketball team. And there were a couple of athletes, I think 3 athletes that was on that team. And I think there was a maximum that you could have that were scholarship athletes. And they got to the round just before official referees. You had student refs. So it was the last round before the official referees. And they played another team that happened to be, and they were an all-black team, and they played another team that happened to be an all-white team that did not have any athletes on their team, and at least not scholarship athletes. And it was a real scrappy game, and it went for a long time, and to the point where we were out there practically in the dark because we hadn't gotten to the courts with lights yet. And what I saw happen in the crowd as people were cheering, there were obvious calls that the student refs were kind of pressured into making. And I think it was kind of like the David and Goliath scenario that was kind of going on as well with the underdogs, and the other team was an underdog team. And what bothered me was it seemed to divide black and white. And these were people that didn't know, you know, one or the other. It just seemed that the blacks were for the blacks and the whites were for the whites. And then some of the comments and things that started to be yelled on the court during the game, it just really disheartened me. And I literally went back to my room in tears. They lost the game by, I want to say 2 points or something. And I was so disheartened. And I was disheartened to the point that I decided to write a letter to the Observer. And I wrote this editorial. And what I said was that it bothered me that people who didn't know individuals for who they were took exception to them for what seemed like just the color of their skin, because that's all that was going on there. And what was ironic to me was that I had watched people basically roast themselves in the quad trying to get a tan to approximate darker skin, and yet they were howling against people who had darker skin. And that just seemed like very interesting to me. And I remember the day that article hit the newspaper, you could hear a pin drop in South Dining Hall that day at lunch. And the ironic thing about that scenario is that one of our daughters, my younger daughter, when she was in her freshman year, called me up at work in tears. And I said, "What is wrong?" And she could barely get it out that someone had written an offensive article in the Observer. And what turns out that a student had basically alleged that the only reason there were minorities at Notre Dame was because of affirmative action. And she was incensed. And so what I said to her was that beyond being incensed, when you pull yourself together, you should respond. And that's what she decided to do. And so what I found interesting was that both of us ended up having racial type encounters and responding through the Observer. The difference is that what happened with her response actually led to a union, in that the individual who wrote the article And this really kind of riled up some things on campus. It led to them meeting one another. In meeting one another, they talked about their agreements, their disagreements. They got to know one another better. And this gentleman ran for student council, like I want to say, 2 years later. And he agreed that he would like for her to start a minority student affairs group. They had not had that component or committee, I don't believe, before. At least they didn't have one then. And she chaired that. And that led to them wanting a cultural competency component added to the curricula that would be required of students at Notre Dame, which was the forerunner to what they now have, which is the Moreau program.
So the story arc is pretty interesting to me, right? That from your time in the late 70s, making it all the way to many years later with your daughter, and then it's almost ironic, right, that you both wrote to the Observer, and her influence created what's today the Moreau Seminar, right? And so that's
which she didn't even know. She had no idea. Once I became active on council and became aware of that program, I called her up and I said, "You have no idea what has happened here, because of what you guys initiated." And I think that that's part of what council is trying to communicate to our club leadership when we advocate building relationships. You can start off disagreeing with one another. That may be what brings you together. The same thing that, the Civil Rights Commission was brought together in disagreement that Father Hesburgh chaired. And yet he had a way of bringing them together to find their commonalities. And then once they found the human commonalities, they could now relate to one another outside of emotions and really begin to work towards what works best for both of us. So I think that's part of what we continue to tout to everyone, is that everything needs to start with relationship first.
And so we actually have a question from the audience, another one that I think is pretty timely. What do you see the biggest differences between the current university students and previous generations when they look at race and diversity?
What I see now versus then is only different based on the difference in the times and what was going on in society. Notre Dame is a microcosm of the world that we live in. And we all come from whatever society has ginned up at that time, whatever the issues are in society at that time. That's what comes into the sphere, and once you get there, you feel like you're in a bubble, the bubble of Notre Dame. And I don't take issue with how you come in. I take issue with how you leave. Because to me, the 4 years you are there is the opportunity for a transformative experience. And that's when you should be exposed to people, and you're going to be exposed to people who are different than yourself. One of the things that's a surprise to me is how many people we still have coming into the university now who have never had any interaction with anyone different than themselves.
Correct.
And so once again, microcosm of the country, because of the way our country is laid out. I mean, we have rural areas, we have very remote areas, we have urban kids that have never been outside of their neighborhood boundaries, and so they've not been to school potentially with people who are different than themselves, with the exception of probably Hispanics and Native Americans. Everybody else has kind of been exposed to someone, as a minority, but that's probably what I would say. It really isn't really that different. It's just a function of what the issues were then in society and what the issues are now. And I think that's what presents at our university. And the challenge is what doesn't change is the platitudes and platform that Notre Dame was founded upon by the Holy Cross Brothers. So
yeah, and so by the way, I like the way you put it. It's not what you do when you're on campus; it's how you leave, right? And that echoes a quote from Father Hesburgh, and I'm going to paraphrase that: challenging challenging the things in society that are wrong doesn't stop, when you leave campus.
Right.
And so I know I'm getting the quote totally wrong, but that always resonated with me. That
Which
he
is
was
significant for alumni, because
right.
you go from the campus sphere into the alumni sphere. And so when we, as part of our mission on council, the goal is twofold. One is to represent the programming opportunities that our diversity boards, that being the Black Alumni Board, the Hispanic Board, the Native American Board, and the Asian Pacific Board, the programming that they have designed for engaging more of our diverse alums into club activities. We are representing those opportunities through our clubs with our regional directors, of which we have 12 across the country. Right. And then the second purpose of council is to address matters of diversity, issues of diversity between diverse alumni and the university and or the association, and vice versa. And the idea is not just to cater to our diverse alums, but to give everyone diverse experiences. The statue on campus where Christ's arms are open out to welcome all, our alumni are to welcome all. So that's all in the family. I mean, we're all part of the Notre Dame family. And I know that people take exception to being a part of our clubs sometimes because they don't feel comfortable, they don't feel welcome, they don't have relationships established with typically the core people that are in our clubs. And we're hoping that by the outreach from our leadership in our clubs that we can change that.
Right.
That's the goal.
So speaking of being an alumni, after Notre Dame, right, you had your Air Force commission.
Yes.
Right. And so you went to the Air Force, and tell us a little bit about that experience.
It was outstanding. I would never have chosen what they chose me to do. As I mentioned before, I had been interested in medicine. Being idealistic, I was disappointed with the curricula in med school not involving psychology and sociology courses when you had to deal with human beings. And so I thought, well, rather than to be one, let me control them. And so then I thought I'd pursue healthcare administration. And when I came out, they did not need healthcare administrators in the military. They were starting a whole new command, and it was called Space Command. And so literally when I got my call to get my assignment, they said, you're going to be assigned to space. And I said, space. And I literally said this to the guy. I said, do you mean like beam me up Scotty space? Or are you talking about rearranging things logistically space?
There
was silence on the other end of the phone. And I thought, they're probably thinking, who is this we're having come in to a professional category in the United States Air Force? And of course it was beam me up Scotty space. And they took my science background, and I was trained.
And they still let you in. And they still let you
in. Of course. It was outstanding. They loved me. No, but it was really quite an exciting experience. I always say the military, they could train an ant to build a house. I mean, it's amazing. Okay. And so I joined the space program. I did command and control for the military weather satellite program. And that involved launch, command and control, and acquisition from defense contractors, and absolutely loved it. So it did me well, and I think I did them well too.
So talk about that like a little bit. Just, I mean, I think it's pretty cool. So you're working with satellites, and these are, I guess, weather satellites, but other satellites, and so this is way before GPS.
Actually, GPS existed, but it existed as a military satellite program.
Okay.
So GPS was one of the satellite programs that was an affinity program to mine in my command. But what I didn't realize, and you don't really think about it, but no troops move without weather data. No military action happens in any of the forces without weather data. So the program I was affiliated with had rather high priority with regard to accessing that weather data around the world. And the ironic thing was when I chose to get out of the Air Force, because I really didn't have any connection to Notre Dame all this time. But I was in Los Angeles when I was getting ready to get out of the Air Force, and I was connected to some other Black alums, and they mentioned to me about a gentleman who was the class of 60 by the name of Ben Finley. And he was like a legend, I guess, in Los Angeles. He worked with Hughes Aircraft as an aerospace engineer. And so I connected with him because, you know, our degree is golden. And so therefore we, you know, job opportunities and things. And so I was talking with Ben, and that was the time that Father Hesburgh had enlisted select people that were Black alums to bring back to campus, inquire about why they had not been more active. And he and Chuck Lennon basically fostered the creation of the first minority alumni group, which was the Black alumni group.
Right.
And I became engaged in that process and came to the very first Black alumni reunion, which was in the late 80s, and spoke while I was on campus to Air Force ROTC people before I left. And so that's how I kind of got re-engaged. And it was about relationships. It was that relationship that I had with current domers, and then their relationship with him, and then, you know, reestablishing relationship with people, and, you know, coming back to other reunions. And, you know, I just kind of stayed engaged. And as I kept moving with my career, I connected to the Notre Dame Club. And actually that was in Akron, Ohio. We moved from Los Angeles to Akron, and I became active again, but through relationships. A gentleman in my church invited me to an event, and I went, and then I became active with the club, and then I joined the board. And so that kind of continued. I moved again, actually back to Los Angeles. And what really fostered my time with council had to do with the fact that I was hearing the same issues, complaints, challenges that people had had back 40 years ago when I was in school. I was hearing this being echoed through my daughter's friends, through other generations after them. And I thought, what is going on? And so I was attentive to my email that was coming from the Alumni Association. And I saw where you could apply to be, to run for a regional director for Diversity Council. And my thought was, enough. We've got to stop this. It's time to stop that rhetoric. You know, it's time to stop those complaints, and let's see what we can do about it. And that was what brought me to join council.
Gotcha. And so, so now you're the head of the Alumni Association Diversity Council. I'd like to read the mission of the AADC. It's 3 points: to represent a united voice on issues and interest of Black, Hispanic, Asian Pacific, and Native American alumni of the university. 2, to collaborate with and support the work of the respective diversity boards of these ethnic groups through relationships with Notre Dame clubs and affinity groups, so Young ND, Senior Alumni, ND Women Connect, and to support the university's diversity goals. So I guess I think it's hard for just the regular alumni, right, that to understand, the mission based on just these words, right? And so how they interact with the AADC and help further these goals, it would really be helpful if we could understand how the AADC is structured.
Okay. We are structured with a managing director, a communications person, and each one of the boards, the diversity boards, that being the Black alumni, Hispanic, Asian Pacific, and Native American, their vice chairs sit on our council. So that's how we connect with them. They provide the programming inputs that they believe would be significant for their constituents to participate in activities in a club. That's translated or transferred to our regional directors, who then connect with diversity coordinators. Each club should have a diversity coordinator. That's just an individual that says, I'm going to be focused on where we can connect and do things with people who are different than ourselves, whether they are alumni or just the community in general. We can engage in diverse types of activities as an enriching experience, because if we're a force for good, it's not just within our bubble, it's a force for good in the world. So
that's the whole point,
we should be mindful of that. And then what we've done is we've provided resources. And so I'm going to share my screen so that I can share with you the actual site. So when we go into MyND, and this is before they do the Hive Bright transfer, if you go into MyND, this is what you'll see. You go into Connect, and you go into Connect, and you go to Clubs. And when you go to Clubs, you see the Force for Good. You come down, and there's Club Hub. And club leaders know about this, of course, because that's what they use to share different best practices among clubs. So once you get into Club Hub, there across the navigation bar at the top, there's events. Under events, there's diversity programming. You go into diversity programming, and you can see that we have resources here that will tell you, first of all, just the commitment of the university statement with regard to diversity and inclusion. And then a statement from Father Jenkins. And then as you go down, we have different initiatives that our clubs can partake of, from the most simple administrative type things like having a diversity coordinator to help guide your club in their activities, down to hosting different issues that would be issues of interest that have diversity as a topic, supporting your teachers to come to the conference, the teachers conference they have on campus, membership open houses, just an invitation to come to a meeting, personal invitation, someone calling you up and saying, why don't you meet me for a coffee, or, let's just get together for lunch. And because I haven't seen you at any events, and invite you to come. And then down to actually nominating people to serve on the different diversity boards. The other thing we have here as resources, we met at the Spring Leadership Conference that's held on campus in April each year. We have done workshops the last several years, and there's information here from the actual workshop that we did, where we asked different clubs what their issues were. Where are your struggles and your barriers? I guarantee you can probably find the challenges that everybody's going through. It's not unlike something that you're going through as well. But in addition to that, there's some recommendations as to how to address those. And then there's existing events and initiatives that clubs are doing to give people ideas of things they can do. One of the things I'll say about these dinners, you can have these dinners with regard to ethnic foods. It's not about the food. It's about the people,
that's
the
right,
information, the knowledge that's exchanged, that you learn about the individuals that you're dining with, or the food the background of the food, the culture that it's coming to you. One thing I'll say about the food pantries, the fact that you're serving people that are diverse does not make a diverse event or activity. It's about if you're engaging with them, if they're engaging with you, if they're being enriched by you and you're being enriched by them at the personal level, not based on a need that someone has. That's simply social justice work that you're doing. We're talking about building relationships. There's ideas, mentoring programs, different masses that you can go to, Spanish masses, Asian masses that are done in those languages. Then there's some recommendations and just some things to be mindful of. The fact that clubs have 6 C's that they are trying to, abide by. And all of these events and activities fit within those 6 C's. We're not asking you to reinvent the wheel. So those are some of the things that we would encourage people to be mindful of.
Sure, that's a lot of great ideas, and all right. So when you log in, you go to the Club Hub, and then that should direct you to those programs.
Correct. Under events, correct.
Great. Well, I really hope that people take advantage of that. I mean, it's just being a force for good, right? It's who we are. And so thank you so much for that. And so what's coming down the pipe for the AADC? What are the things that you're excited about?
Well, as you know, our nation is quite challenged right now with regard to matters of race and diversity issues, and especially where African Americans are concerned. So we've been very involved in conversations with leadership at the university. And I will say that just earlier this week, Father Jenkins released a letter that indicated the actions that he is committed to taking based on the inputs requests that we as a council and the diversity boards put before he and the provost and the vice president of student affairs. And so part of what we have been asking for is an Office of Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion, in addition to having an overhaul of the Moreau program, because unfortunately, our minority students, because our minority enrollment is very small, especially compared to many of our peer institutions, our African American enrollment is less than 4%. It's like 3.6%. So the fact that we are still quite behind our peers in that regard makes it very difficult for our students on campus when it comes to doing some of the things that we understand are critical psychologically to their ongoing success.
Absolutely.
And those are things like affirming their identity, giving opportunity for community to be built, and opportunity for leadership to be cultivated. If you don't have those things happening, and by the way, it's not just for students, it works the same for our diverse alums psychologically. People need to have their identities affirmed. They need to have that happen before they can be expected to build a community. And then in community, until you have a community, you don't really have space and confidence to really stretch your wings and fly with regard to cultivating your leadership skills. So the same pattern that's following on campus, we need to have that happen off campus in the alumni world as well. So those are the things that we're involved in right now, making sure that we can ensure that the university stewards some of the feedback that they got from recent young alums that were posted in a change.org petition that indicated everything from, being hassled by the on-campus police to not having mental health professionals that can address issues that look like you and can relate to you, not having the appropriate support systems in place, still having inappropriate racial slurs and racial racist activities happening on campus without any punitive follow-up. There's no consequences to behavior. So those are the things we're working on. We've asked our clubs to be more mindful of having open conversations with people different than themselves, inviting people in to have these conversations so that you can get to know one another as part of the indie family. It's like saying, yeah, I've got a cousin, my cousin Joe over here that I never talk to, but yet I'm going to have a party and Joe, you should come. But Joe doesn't know you, but they're part of the family. So it would be nice if you invited Joe, personally and engage with them. Because after all, if you reflect on it, the people that you are engaging with at your events and activities are people that you did have relationship with. If you didn't have relationships with them, you wouldn't be present either. So those are the kinds of things that we're trying to move forward on. And I will say that we are going to, one of the recent ideas, I've been talking with the Clow Center as well. The Clow Center is part of the law school and devoted to civil rights and human rights, founded by Father Hesburgh in 1973, actually. And they have some outstanding programming that's going on right now called Building an Anti-Racist Vocabulary. And there are talks every Friday at 12:45. And eventually there will be the former Attorney General, Eric Holder will be one of them. Tomorrow, Nicole Hannah-Jones, who is an African-American graduate that won the MacArthur Award, she's going to be speaking. She's with the New York Times and fostered the 1619 Project about slavery. And
that's tomorrow.
That's tomorrow. At
That is
12:45 Eastern, but you have to register. So I'm going to share my screen one more time, and I will share this this resource page that shows you. If you go to cloud.nd.edu, you can look for the Building an Anti-Racist Vocabulary. And please register. They do have over 800 people as of last week. That you do need to have an nd.edu or an alumni.nd.edu email address in order to access these programs. But once you register, you'll be signed up for the entire series. The other program place that you can get information is the Croc. And this is the most recent conversation that I participated in. This lady is the former president of Mount Holyoke, as well as Spelman, which is an HBCU, all girls HBCU in Atlanta. She's on the board at Mount Holyoke, at Smith, at Spelman, and at Morehouse, which is a all male HBCU in Atlanta. She spoke with the Kroc Institute earlier this week, And it was quite enlightening with regard to how powerful it is for young people to be supported by people who are going through the same challenges that they are when they come to an institution and they're in a minority setting. So she wrote a book called Why Do All the Black Kids Sit Together, and Other Conversations About Race. And I won't spoil it for anybody, but if you go to this link, you can actually hear her presentation. It was recorded.
Got it. All right. We'll make sure those links are in the show notes after when we publish the video.
Okay. All right.
So, what's your call to action for our audience?
Get to know someone different than yourself this year. That's I would say that more than one, and reflect on what you learn about yourself, what you learn about them. There are a couple of quotes I want to share from, I'll start with, these are things I've seen on people's emails or otherwise. Knowing others is intelligence, knowing yourself is true wisdom. Mastering others is strength, but mastering yourself is where true power comes in. This was at the bottom of the lady that's responsible for the actual recruitment of diverse faculty. Dr. Martin Luther King said, "I am convinced that men hate each other because they fear each other. And they fear each other because they don't know each other. And they don't know each other because they don't communicate with each other. And they don't communicate with each other because they're separated from each other." He also said, "We must remember that intelligence is just not enough. Intelligence plus character, that's the goal of our true education," which speaks to how we come out of Notre Dame. And then Father Hesburgh said, "The more one contemplates the essential oneness of humanity, our common hopes and dreams on this smallish planet so hopelessly divided racially, culturally, religiously, and politically, the more one hungers for moral leadership." And so he said, Father Hesburgh, "It is time to begin anew, perhaps with more realism and less naivete this time, to commit this country to be what it professes before all the world to be. If this means afflicting the powerful, the smug, the leaders who do not lead, the complacent, those who have never had it so well, then so be it." So what I would say is that based on those inputs, I would just encourage us to really take to heart the faith that we practice religiously, that we really put that to task in our daily lives. And that is, getting to know someone different than yourself, but it's also taking it upon yourself to do some resource digging, to, participate in these programs that Notre Dame's got going on, to go online and find other resources and information that might answer some questions you have, because unfortunately, some people are not willing to answer all your questions right now, because they feel like, it's not like I'm your expert on these matters. I didn't go to school to learn any knowledge about diversity, inclusion, and equity, but I'm a Christian. I'm a Catholic Christian. I know right from wrong. I was raised to know what's right from wrong, and that's it. And I have passion for how I want to be treated, and other people are the same way. So I encourage people to just be mindful of that, and don't look to people who are minorities or people of color as if they've got the true answers to everything. We're human just like everyone else, but we just have a desire to be treated like everyone else.
Right. So it's really
one more thing, Dan.
Oh yes, absolutely.
If you're in an environment where inappropriate things are being said or stated, have courage. If you have to, make the sign of the cross and ask the good Lord Jesus and the Holy Spirit to come upon you right then and there to help you know what to say and to protect you once you've said it, then please do that, so that you can help stem the tide of things continuing. And that starts in your house, at your dinner table, in your bedrooms. Stop it where you can, so that it doesn't continue to proliferate and grow. And then that will influence the character of the individuals that present themselves at the University of Our Lady.
Well, representation matters, right? And so being being together with people of diverse cultures and putting yourself in their shoes is a wonderful thing. And really, it's not just being a force for good, but we're all part of the Notre Dame network, and the Notre Dame network is famous, right, for being this living thing. And the network only works if you continue to work those muscles. So,
most definitely.
Anyway, why don't we move to Q&A? If anybody has any questions, at the bottom of your screen, please click on the Q&A button and you can enter a question. We have a couple people thanking you. Gretchen Zerzek from the Notre Dame Club of Pittsburgh. David Krashna, so Judge Krashna, he is saying that he wants to thank you. He's also a Black alum. And so now you actually have a little bit of a Pittsburgh connection, right?
I do. And
yeah.
so, I was torn between, should I try to find some black and gold, or should I, come with my Notre Dame stuff? So I opted for Notre Dame, but I'm a Steeler fan. So I was a Steeler fan when I was back in the besides Notre Dame. I also went to the Super Bowl when the Steelers played the Vikings in New Orleans. Okay. And it was in New Orleans that year. And wow, was that fabulous. It was freezing, but it was fabulous. And my big hero, and I'm a huge fan of Franco Harris. And so my Franco Harris story is that when I lived in Akron, I worked for the cable company. It was Time Warner. I was the director of community relations. It was my responsibility to shepherd and kind of escort the person who was the speaker. We provided the MC for the breakfast ceremony where they received their jackets for the induction into the Hall of Fame, Football Hall of Fame. And because that was part of my system in Canton, Ohio. And so that year, their coach was being inducted into the Hall of Fame. And so all the former players had come back. So of course, Franco Harris came back. So the gentleman that was being escorted, this was way back when CNN had sports actually, was a sports anchor by the name of Vince Cellini. And so Vince said, Avis, I know you love Franco Harris. He's here. I said, no way. He said, yes. He says, and actually he's here to promote a Motorola product or whatever, and he's going to do a press conference. And I was just like, oh my gosh. And I was just excited he was like in the building that I was in. Yeah. And then Vince said, would you like to go to the press conference? And I said, what? He said, you can go to the press conference. I said, how? He says, I'm CNN Sports. I'll just flash my credentials and we'll walk right in. So we did. And I tell you, I think it was one of the few times I was ever speechless. I could say nothing. And it was just he, myself, Vince, and another man in the room. Oh my gosh. He came over. Vince told him what a big fan I was. He hugged me. He gave me a kiss on my cheek. And the funny thing is, he gave me his phone number and said, if you're ever in Pittsburgh and you want to go to a game, call me. So what did I do? There you go. I go running out. I call my husband. You have no idea whose phone number I have. And I never took him up on it. But it was great to just know it. So
sure,
I'm good.
Sure.
It's all
absolutely, good. Absolutely. So we have a very interesting request from somebody. Can you play the alma mater on that piano behind you? I think that's a little much for this evening. Let's see if we are still getting some people coming in. Oh, here we go. Okay, this is very relevant for today. Do you think that the actions taken by professional athletes in these last couple of days to protest racism will affect change or effectively continue the conversation? Now, the NBA, for the people that don't know, the NBA, they canceled or they postponed a day's worth of playoff games. The WNBA did the same thing. The tennis player Naomi Osaka, who is half black, half Japanese, she withdrew from a pretty big tournament. So there's been
Major League Baseball also.
Major League Baseball, that's correct, right? So there's been a lot of action there. So how would you how would you address that?
I think that part of what the Sportswell and even Mike Tirico said last night when he was being interviewed about this, sportscaster Mike Tirico indicated that sports activism is at an all-time high. People, the other night, one of the basketball playoff games on the jersey, they talked about how players, didn't want to have their name because it indicated the fact that were it not for that jersey, they too could be one of those individuals that's being used in the street by the police. And this has gotten to a human level. It's like Coach Doc Rivers said last night. It's stunning how we can love a country that doesn't seem to love us. And he's referring specifically to African-American males. Absolutely. And the fact that things have really gotten to this point where folks are still bold enough, despite the horror of George Floyd's murder, they are still bold enough to continue with what I'm going to say is very inappropriate, careless, unfounded type of behavioral response, violent behavioral response, escalated response. And when you compare it with how the response was to the gentleman who shot the protesters night before last, and the fact that he's walking down the street with an assault rifle, and his hands up, and he passes by armored police vehicles, and people are saying this person shot someone, and no one does anything, and he happens to be a white person. It's like that disparity is just unconscionable, and we have too many of those that are still going on. Right. The fact that you've got, Breonna Taylor and her situation still not been addressed and responded to. It's just
over 150 days. Right.
It's just too much. And so I think that what we're seeing that these athletes are human beings. They are human beings. We've placed them on pedestals depending upon how people feel about, celebrity status as an athlete because of their athletic abilities, but they're a human being first. Men, women, and it could be them. It could be any one of their family members. There are professionals that have been, I can't remember the name of the person that was cornered in Vegas by the police after a fight or something in town. And he was walking back to his hotel and it was late and he got, slammed up against the car, somebody fitting your description kind of thing. So these are human beings. And they're saying, if I need to use my position, my status in order to have change occur, then so be it. So for me, I'm glad that they recognize that these are their fellow human beings that are suffering, and they're using their position, their status, their access, which I think any of us would do as we could in order to right a wrong.
Yeah, my take, I think, with this is that there's still that vilification of the athlete. Right. So going back to the 1968 Olympics, to Colin Kaepernick, to LeBron James a few years ago. And as you said, they're entitled to their opinion, right? They're human beings. And especially since without that jersey, as you said, they could be, another statistic, which is frightening. And it's just awful. So,
and there's not been any response. There's not been any acceptable response. The fact that there's been no response is part of the challenge. And they're just asking for change. It's time for change. It's not unlike what we were doing at Notre Dame. We're saying, Father Jenkins, we got to have change. Those students that did the change.org petition, we have to have change. This is no longer acceptable. It's gone on for far too long. It's not part of the brand, So let's not be hypocritical.
Gotcha. Well, we have come to the end of our hour. I want to thank the audience for coming tonight and participating in our show. Please follow the Notre Dame Club of Pittsburgh on social media at ndpitclub.com or ndpitclub on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you to Avis Boyd for being with us tonight. This has been a wonderful talk and very enlightening to me. I'm learning so much more about the AADC and not just the mission, but actually how to get to the AADC and be more involved. And we'll have all this information in the show notes. Thank you again, Avis. Thank you to the audience. This has been another installment of Racial and Social Justice Beyond the Dome. Until next time, be safe and go Irish.
Bye, everybody. Stay well.